cold, clinical glow of a trading floor in 1998, the numbers on the screen began to lie. Most people see a stock ticker as a heartbeat, a pulse of the global economy. But for Semyon Mogilevich, those numbers were just a game of shadows. He is a man who doesn't exist in the way you or I do. He's a ghost, a whisper in the ears of oligarchs, a man who managed to steal billions without ever pulling a trigger. They call him the Brainy Don, a name that suggests a lethal combination of a street thug's ruthlessness and a mathematician's precision. Born in 1946 in the heart of Kiev, Ukraine, Mogilevich wasn't a product of the gutter. He was a product of the academy. While his peers were learning the brutal trade of the gulags, Semyon was earning a degree in economics from Lviv University. It's this academic foundation that makes him the most dangerous man in the world. He didn't just understand money, he understood the plumbing of the global financial system. He knew where the pipes were leaky, and he knew how to reroute the flow into his own pockets. He looked at the world not through the lens of ideology, but through the cold metrics of a balance sheet. The silent witness to his early rise wasn't a blood-stained knife, but the blue-tinted carbon paper of forged transit visas. In the 1970s, as Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union began to rise, Semyon saw a vacuum. He promised to sell the assets of those leaving, their homes, their family heirlooms, their life's work, and wire them the proceeds once they were safe in the West. Instead, he simply kept it all. He didn't just take their money, he took their futures, leaving behind a trail of people who had been erased before they even crossed the border. This was his first masterclass in the art of the vanish. By the time the Iron Curtain collapsed in 1991, Mogilevich was ready. The world was distracted by the fall of statues and the birth of new nations. But Semyon was focused on the chaos. He moved to Budapest, setting up a labyrinth of shell companies that stretched from the cobblestone streets of Prague to the glass towers of Manhattan. Psychologically, Mogilevich is a predator of high intellect. He suffers from a profound sense of megalomania, yet it is tempered by a chilling ice-water patience. He views human beings as mere variables in an equation, tools to be used until they are blunt, then discarded. He famously realized early on that if you control the money, you don't need to control the people. They will follow the scent of the prophet. The FBI would eventually place him on the 10 most wanted list, but that felt like a participation trophy for a man of his stature. His true masterpiece began in a nondescript office in Newtown, Pennsylvania, a company called YBM Magnex. To the outside world, it was a successful manufacturer of industrial magnets. It was traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It had high-profile board members and glowing audits from top-tier firms. But it was a phantom. For years, the stock price climbed, fueled by fake invoices and imaginary shipments. Investors poured hundreds of millions into a company that produced nothing but air. The silent witness here was a simple ledger, discovered during a 1998 raid, that showed two different versions of reality, one for the public and one for the man in Budapest. But as the 1990s came to a close, the scale of his ambition began to threaten more than just a few investors. He was moving into the one market that keeps the world turning: energy. He was preparing to hold the entire continent of Europe by the throat, controlling the very pipes that heated their homes in the dead of winter. The ghost was no longer just haunting the shadows. He was preparing to flip the switch on the global economy itself. And the most terrifying part? He had just found a way to make the world's most powerful governments his silent partners. To do this, he didn't use a sawed-off shotgun or a fleet of black sedans. He used a fountain pen and a network of shell companies so dense it would take a decade for the brightest minds in the FBI to even find the entrance to the maze. The year was 1995 when the ghost found a home in the unlikeliest of places: Newtown, Pennsylvania. To the neighbors, YBM Magnex International was a booming success story, a producer of industrial magnets that had somehow cracked the code of the chaotic post-Soviet market. Its stock was the darling of the Toronto Stock Exchange, soaring from pennies to $20 a share. It looked like the American dream, wrapped in a Canadian bow. But if you peeled back the glossy brochures and the audited financial statements, you didn't find magnets. You found a vacuum. Mogilevich wasn't just running a business, he was practicing financial origami. He used his degree in economics from Lviv University not to build, but to camouflage. For the investigators, the silent witness wasn't a blood-stained knife. It was a stack of shipping manifests for magnets that never existed, and wire transfer receipts that circled the globe like a satellite, never touching the ground. This was the pump and dump scheme, elevated to a high art. Mogilevich's foot soldiers weren't just street thugs. They were accountants and lawyers who knew how to cook the books until they smelled like a five-star meal. When the bubble finally burst in May 1998, $600 million of shareholder value evaporated into the ether. The investors weren't just fleeced, they were erased by a man who treated the global stock market like a personal ATM. But for the man they called the Brainy Don, YBM was just a proof of concept. His psychological profile reveals a man who experiences the world as a series of cold, binary choices. There is no empathy in his ledger, only leverage. To Mogilevich, a person is a tool, a politician is an asset, and a national border is merely a suggestion. He viewed the collapse of the Soviet Union not as a geopolitical tragedy, but as the clearance sale of the century. His most audacious move involved the very lifeblood of Eastern Europe. Through a series of opaque shell companies like Uraltransgas and later Rosukrenergo, Mogilevich positioned himself as the invisible middleman between Russian gas giants and Ukrainian consumers. He wasn't just skimming off the top, he was the gatekeeper. By controlling the flow of natural gas, he gained something more valuable than gold: political immunity. He made himself the indispensable cog in the machine that kept the lights on in Kiev and the furnaces burning in Moscow. He was the only man who could bridge the gap between the legitimate boardrooms of the West and the blood-soaked concrete of the East. The FBI began to realize they weren't dealing with a mobster in a tracksuit. They were chasing a titan of industry who happened to have a standing order for assassinations. His movements were a masterclass in evasion, moving between Budapest, Moscow, and Prague, always one step ahead of the warrants. He lived in the gray zone, where the legitimate economy and the underworld bleed into one another until you can't tell the CEO from the hitman. As the heat in the United States intensified, the ghost retreated to the one place that would never hand him over. In 2003, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed a 45-count indictment against him, including racketeering, securities fraud, and money laundering. They thought they had him cornered. They thought the paper trail would lead to handcuffs. But as investigators stared at the empty offices in Pennsylvania and the frozen bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, they realized the horrifying scale of their failure. Semyon Mogilevich hadn't just built a criminal empire. He had woven himself into the very fabric of the Russian state, becoming a man who knew too many secrets to ever be allowed to fall. And just as the FBI prepared their most aggressive move yet, the ghost did something no one expected. He didn't run. He walked right into the light, daring the world to come and take him. Cess in Pennsylvania and the frozen bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, they realized the horrifying scale of their failure. Semyon Mogilevich hadn't just built a criminal empire, he had woven himself into the very fabric of the Russian state, becoming a man who knew too many secrets to ever be allowed to fall. And just as the FBI prepared their most aggressive move yet, the ghost did something no one expected. He didn't run. He walked right into the light, daring the world to come and take him. In January 2008, the world's most sophisticated law enforcement agencies thought the impossible had happened. Moscow police moved in on a high-end shopping district, pulling the legendary Brainy Don from the passenger seat of a luxury SUV. The charge was almost comical: tax evasion involving a local cosmetics chain. It was a far cry from the multi-billion-dollar stock fraud or the nuclear materials trafficking the FBI had spent decades documenting. For a brief moment, it seemed the ghost had been tethered. The Department of Justice scrambled to mobilize. They had a 45-count indictment waiting in Philadelphia, a mountain of evidence detailing the YBM Magnex disaster, a $150 million phantom empire built on nothing but forged audits and the sheer force of Mogilevich's will. But the Russian legal system is a labyrinth designed by the Minotaur himself. By July 2009, the charges vanished like mist. The Russian Interior Ministry claimed the case lacked substance, and Mogilevich walked out of the detention center a free man. Semyon Mogilevich didn't slink back into the shadows. He moved into a fortified high-rise in Moscow, a literal stone's throw from the corridors of power. This is the ultimate psychological gambit of the high-intellect sociopath: hide in plain sight. When you are the one who controls the taps of the Gazprom pipelines, when you hold the ledgers of every oligarch's dirty laundry, you aren't a fugitive. You are an asset. To understand Mogilevich is to understand the evolution of the criminal mind. He isn't a street thug with a hair-trigger temper. He is a macroeconomist with a degree from Lviv University who weaponized capitalism. He views the global financial system not as a series of laws, but as a collection of vulnerabilities. His empathy is non-existent, replaced by a cold, transactional logic. In his world, people are just variables in an equation where the solution is always his own enrichment. In 2015, the FBI did something that felt like a quiet surrender. They removed Semyon Mogilevich from their 10 most wanted list. The official reason was that the United States has no extradition treaty with Russia, making his capture an impossibility. But the subtext was much darker. The ghost had won. He had become so deeply integrated into the geopolitical infrastructure that removing him might cause the very walls of international trade to crumble. Today, he remains the Don of Dons, a man who hasn't been seen in a courtroom in decades, but whose influence is felt every time a shell company opens in a tax haven or a political campaign is mysteriously funded by offshore accounts. He is the architect of the modern world's darkest corners, a man who realized that the greatest way to avoid prison is to make yourself indispensable to the people who build them. But there is a final, chilling revelation that keeps federal agents awake at night. In the rare interviews he's granted, Mogilevich doesn't deny his past. He laughs at it. He knows that in the digital age, blood on the hands is easily washed away with zeros on a screen. As you sit there, listening to the story of the man they couldn't catch, know this: his money is likely moving through a bank in your city, tucked away in an investment fund you might even own a piece of. Semyon Mogilevich isn't just a ghost the FBI can't catch. He's the ghost that has already moved into your house, and he has no intention of ever leaving.